Welcome to Shooting Straight with A1F.com. I'm Frank Miniter, the editor-in-chief of the NRA's America's First Freedom. Today we have the great pleasure of speaking with David Kopel, researcher, an attorney, an author, a contributor to America's First Freedom, and the research director for the Independence Institute. Now, he wrote an article for us recently on armed self-defense, and there are new stats out there recently, and they're not getting much media coverage. Is that what you see out there, David? The media just doesn't want to talk about how many of these there are.
That is true. There's a smaller media space for any kind of social science these days. And yes, in general, the media tends to focus on harmful gun misuse rather than beneficial gun use.
Right. We're looking at the latest study, the 2021 National Firearm Survey, right? By Georgetown, by William English at Georgetown, found at 1.67 million defensive gun uses per year, an average, based on polling. That's a large number. It's amazing to me that the media is able to, I'm not surprised, being I know we run an armed citizen column in the NRA magazines, and that doesn't, local news will run that sort of stuff, but national media almost never, other than maybe Fox News. So I guess I'm not surprised, but given what you do, I'm just, in all the data you look into and as a researcher, are you baffled by that you just can't get this stuff to the mainstream media?
No, I was a media critic for the Rocky Mountain News, from 2001 to 2009. And that was one of the two major dailies in Denver. So in all that process, I read a lot of newspaper articles about science or social science issues, and I'd say that science reporting is one of the weakest things for general circulation mainstream media. The reporters typically don't understand something beyond the press release level.
And the politics, right?
Yes.
They tend to be from a certain strain of politics that doesn't make this favorable to their narratives.
That is true. Not everybody in the traditional media is biased, but there's a food chain of the reporters and the editors and all that. And so there's not a lot of incentive for most reporters to go out and find the beneficial uses of firearms for protection.
Now, you went through the history in this article of these studies, including one, and I didn't know this, that was allegedly or possibly suppressed by the CDC for a long time. Can you go through that? Because this science isn't really that old. It started, in the 1980s, did it?
Well, the first time we had a national poll or a major pollster asking about defensive gun use was the Field poll in 1976. And Field was a long-standing major political pollster in California. And then over the next 18 years, there were a total of 18 studies in that period by various pollsters, Gallup, Hart, Terrence, all the rest. And they came to estimates of, depending on the poll, of defensive gun uses in the United States of as low as 746,000 annually, or as high as 3.5 million. And then Gary Kleck and Mark Gertz did a much more sophisticated survey in the early 90s, and that was published in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology from Northwestern Law School, I believe in 1995. And that came up with a midpoint of 2.5 million plus with a range of 2 to 3 million. Then two gun control advocate scholars, but who are very well respected and highly competent, did a study for the Police Foundation, which is a think tank for big city police chiefs. They got an estimate of 1.46 million. That said, we've actually, now that we've done it, we've decided it's impossible to measure defensive gun use. And then the Centers for Disease Control funded a study in the mid-90s, which found looking only at burglary, found about 600,000 defensive gun uses against burglars annually in the United States. And then the point you're talking about that nobody found out about until much later was the CDC in its behavioral risk survey, which is a very comprehensive study done all across the country. in the late 90s asked about, gave the states that were doing participating in this the option of asking questions about defensive gun use, and there were about 7 states uh, that did so. And that data never got published until much later when it was leaked. But that, based on those 7 states, and then extrapolating, you'd get somewhere over 1 million defensive gun uses annually. And then finally, the best and most recent survey was just published a few months ago in a preliminary form, and that was done by William English. He's a professor at Georgetown University, and as he says, it's a lot easier these days to do large scale surveys than it was in the past. And so these previous things I talked about had, in any sample, was at most about 5,000 people, and here they got over 16,000 gun owners, and that's where the current estimate of about 1.67 million defensive gun uses annually comes from. But one really important thing to note is that defensive gun use is defined broadly. This would in over 80% of the incidents, it does not involve a shot even being fired. There's lots of situations where brandishing a gun or even referring to a gun is sufficient to end the criminal threat.
Right, that's what English found, wasn't it? It was more than 8 out of 10 did not fire a shot.
That's right.
Right.
Guns have a large deterrent effect, and most criminals, they see a victim with a gun, they decide it's time to quit work early today.
Yeah, it's true. No, I had one myself years ago. Someone decided to try to beat down my front door, and I grabbed a shotgun and grabbed a phone. And he was kicking my door. He had the courtesy or the good sense to look in a window as well, and saw a shotgun in my hands and the phone in my other hand. And he took off, and the police got there, and it was all kind of taken care of pretty quickly. But right, I felt a lot better knowing I was armed, and that was quite a long time ago in a bad neighborhood outside of New York City. But it happens a lot more than the media acknowledges, and I think a lot of people really realize.
I think that's true. And the sort of the research organizations that try to be fairly neutral on this, I believe the Centers for Disease Control had a special task force that looked at things, and they said, we really can't tell exactly, but it's at least several hundred thousand, and it's probably at least twice as often as criminal use of a gun in a crime. There's about, as of 2008, the relevant year, there were about 300,000 of those, and the defensive gun uses were probably 600,000 or more.
Well, given that they possibly here sat on this data for so long, the CDC, I mean, it makes me that much more reluctant to then go in and fund a group like the CDC to do this kind of research, because it's going to be, my feeling about it is, and this of course has been come out in the past, that they do behave politically.
Well, that's true, and I think all the antics of Dr. Fauci and the others on the CDC leadership on the novel coronavirus 19 pandemic have made a lot of people much more skeptical about the alleged expertise of the CDC. It's not that they don't have experts there, but it seems that those experts are subject to a lot of political filtration.
Now, is there enough data to show whether married to crime rate or what have you, is there a rise and a fall of these kind of defensive gun uses, or is there just not enough data to tell?
Well, I think what Gary Kleck would say is, based on his analysis, is that you would expect defensive gun uses to rise and fall at approximately the same rate as crime in general. So if you were, say, comparing crime in 1991 versus crime in, let's say, 2014, violent crime had fallen by about half in that period. So Kleck hadn't done a year-by-year study on this, but his view was you would expect defensive gun use to fall by about half. So in 2014, he would estimate, you'd have something over 1 million defensive gun uses, but not over 2 million like we did in the higher crime early 90s.
Gun owners also tend to be a closed-mouth bunch. I mean, it's a big, diverse group, over 100 million in this country. So you can't put them in one box. But at least the ones I know, and myself in particular, we tend not to want to talk to pollsters and that sort of thing. Was that weighed? Is that a factor that is taken into account?
It's they tried to, the studies try to, the most sophisticated studies at least, try to at least address that. Kleck's back in his early days did a study of, when he was a PhD student, did a study of Illinois gun owners, and he got the list of people who have an Illinois firearms owner's identification card, which is required since 1966 in Illinois to possess a firearm. And even calling the people on the FOID list, which are people who are registered with the government as gun owners, he got a fairly sizable number of people who, when they were talking on the phone to a pollster, denied owning a gun. And Professor English's more recent study talks about surveys that have been done, say, of people with hunting licenses or carry permits. And even there, you get over 10% of the population. They've got a firearm hunting license, but they deny that they own a gun, or they might have be registered in Michigan as a handgun owner, and they'll still deny it. So that there's that factor. And then another factor, not about talking to pollsters, but is just the issue about talking to police is, I think it's fairly clear that at least a large number of DGUs are never reported. And these would probably be the ones that, more likely to be the ones that don't involve a shot being fired. So let me just give one example that I know about personally. A friend in Utah, this was, decades ago, was a very big bicycle guy, and was out on the road, and then some car, for whatever reason, starts trying to run him over, and so the guy pulls his handgun out of the bag on his bike, brandishes at the car, and the car leaves. Now, did that guy call? I don't think that guy called the cops afterwards to report the incident, because I guess from his point of view, not that we talked about it, but I'm inferring, what good is it going to do? He doesn't have the car's plates, enough information, and importantly, this was in the 90s. There was only about 1% of the U.S. population that had a concealed carry permit. So to the extent you have defensive gun use going on outside your own property, some of those people were not necessarily carrying lawfully. And even when you are carrying lawfully, or on your own property and you're a lawful possessor, there's always the risk of some prosecutor saying, well, I am very much against defensive gun ownership. I don't like gun ownership in general, so I'm going to see what kind of charges I can bring against this guy. And the fact that you may have been completely within the law and you'll get acquitted, well, that's $100,000 and a criminal trial later. So there's I think a lot of reluctance among many people to report. And another factor that I think comes into play is some defensive gun use is people who have a criminal past defending themselves against a criminal present. We know that gun crime tends to be disproportionately concentrated against poorer people, and also especially against criminals, because criminals tend to live in poor neighborhoods. They hang out in sketchier situations and all that. So some guy who might have a criminal conviction that makes him ineligible to possess a gun might still possess it, and might use it in a justifiable sense against some criminal attack. But he's definitely not going to call the police, because he'd be reporting himself for illegal possession.
Right, especially in some of the worst neighborhoods and so on.
Yeah.
Even if they're legally carrying, you'd be worried about brandishing laws or other things, and why entangle yourself in that system unless there's a violent person out there that you can stop, or there's some real reason.
Yeah.
If it's just an event that ended, I certainly understand people doing that. It's unfortunate. I'd rather see everyone working with the police and so on, but this is just reality.
It is, and this is it's a constant. These kinds of issues are constant in trying to find out all kinds of polling about various issues. There are people who misreport uh, things, or for all kinds of reasons. It's well known that there's a tendency to, especially when you're doing an oral interview, uh, to want to give the answer that you think is socially acceptable and that the pollster likes. So, for example, you can compare George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who ran in 1968 on the third part American Independent Party as a presidential candidate. You compare, and he was at the time, very into very much playing the race card, and against the civil rights movement, all that, those kind of, in my view, reprehensible positions. And the percentage of people who told, say the Gallup poll or whatever, that they had voted for Wallace was much lower than the people who actually did vote for Wallace, based on the election returns. So there are many confounding factors in opinion polling, and you can have people giving false reports, because they're trying to be pro-gun and invent some story about a defensive gun use that never happened, and others who, even with an anonymous pollster, won't say anything. And the good quality polls try to weed out both of those, or to get things right. But it is not an exact science.
Yeah, my first reaction if someone asked what guns do I own or if I own guns or not is none of your business. They'd have to have a personal connection to me or to get to a certain level. Even though this is what I do for a living, I would still be very careful about what I spoke about. So, wow, thank you, David. Where can people find more about you, follow you, see what you do?
Well, I work at the Independence Institute, which is we're founded in the second oldest state level think tank in the United States, founded on the eternal truths of the Declaration of Independence. But I keep most of my writings at my own website, davekopel.org, where there's lots of stuff, including many articles I've written for America's First Freedom, and longer things for scholarly journals, things like that. davekopel.org.
Well, thanks for writing for us, David.
Thank you, and I look forward to writing some more in the future.